For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello, welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. Today we'll be going into a new subject. We're done with the 7 churches of Asia, and we're going to be starting out in Revelation chapter 4. This is going to be an overview of John's vision of Revelation chapter 4. So I'm going to touch on a lot of the different verses here in Revelation 4 to give us a general understanding about what's going on in this chapter, with a particular emphasis on defining what John means when he talks about heaven, which is a subject matter in this particular chapter. Now, if you want to get the nutshell version of all this, take a look at section 38 in my book that's going to cover in much shorter time period and span what I'll be discussing in this presentation today. Revelation chapter 4 basically begins where we left off in Revelation chapter 3 verse 21, where it talks about how the Laodicean saints, and saints in every church for that matter, will share the throne of God the Father and Jesus Christ. And so as you come to the end of chapter 3, leading up to this ultimate promise of exaltation and eternal life for the overcoming saints who share the throne, the next thing we see starting out in Revelation chapter 4 is the door to heaven is opened. John, what does he see first thing? Oh, there's this throne sitting here. So you can't divorce what we just learned at the end of chapter 3 with John's vision of heaven that opens. And just by way of reminder, what those verses say are in Revelation 3, 20-21, it says, quote, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to him, and will sup with him, and he with me. To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame, and am set down with my Father in his throne." Close quote. So there's the tie-in. This idea of the throne, and as we move into Revelation chapter 4, in verses 1 and 2, it says, quote, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was open in heaven," and then continuing, "and immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne." Close quote. Now, if you notice, we went from Revelation chapter 3:21, where everybody basically who overcomes and qualifies for eternal life and exaltation is sitting on the throne. It's a busy throne. There are a lot of folks there. Got to be a big throne. But here, when we come into Revelation chapter 4, it says one sat on the throne. And so you're sitting there saying, well, now how did we get here? And so, people who don't understand these images and the context of them are thinking John's schizophrenic. He just said there's a whole bunch of people, now we just have one. Well, you have to understand that the 7 letters to the 7 churches, of course, were exactly that. They're written to people in that day, telling them what they need to do in order to overcome and ultimately receive those 12 promises of exaltation and eternal life in the 7 letters. But what John was talking about in those letters hasn't happened yet. He's saying these are the promises. You will get to sit on the throne. Now the vision opens as of 96 AD, when he received his vision on Patmos. And we don't start with the fulfillment of the promises in the future. We start at the beginning. We won't get to the fulfillment of these promises until Revelation chapter 21. And that's 17 chapters away. We got a whole lot of things that you got to go through beginning here in chapter 4. It's kind of like the whole Wizard of Oz thing, you got to start at the beginning. You got to follow the yellow round, but you start at the beginning there, and then eventually, after all the trials and the tribulations, you get to the Emerald City, right? And that's what happens in the book of Revelation. We have this chronological sequence. So if you haven't already listened to my podcast from Come Follow Me number 4. That's from October 22nd of 23, where I talk about the chronological sequence of the book of Revelation in some detail and give you a whole vision from here in chapter 4 all the way until we finally get to 21. But we'll continue to talk about it as we go along, but that's a nice place to go and check it out. Now, the other topic that we need to talk about in some detail is the concept of heaven. Because this is going to be a very important topic as we go through, and it's something that you have to understand what John is talking about now here at the beginning of his visions, or else you're going to confuse yourself as you go through the rest of the content. And heaven as a word kind of tends to have different meanings depending on the context that you find yourself in. And so heaven itself tends to refer to the firmament of heaven or the expanse of heaven. It could be the atmospheric or sidereal, starry heavens, if you will. In English, German, Hebrew, and Greek, they all use the word heaven basically for this concept of the sky or the abode of the gods. And so only the context indicates which of these concepts is intended. And so for the Hebrews, the sky above was considered to be this solid expanse. It was like this curtain, and it extended across the arch above the earth, and whatever the eye can see, with the stars basically being set as gems in that expanse. And so the rains, according to their view of thinking, would fall through these apertures or the windows in the expanse. And so if you were going to have a heavenly messenger that came down from earth, from God's dwelling place, you got to open the curtain, he comes through, and away you go. We also have the view of a new heaven that will be talked about as we go through the book of Revelation. Now, a new heaven in the book of Revelation has at least two meanings. One is we get a new heaven and a new earth, for that matter, at the time of the second coming as the millennial conditions present themselves. But it can also be a reference to the celestial conditions of this earth after the millennium. So that is also a new heaven and a new earth. We also have the celestial kingdom on this earth as the final dwelling of resurrected saints after the millennium. And this we would refer to as the kingdom of heaven, which is the celestial kingdom where our Father in heaven dwells, or more particularly, the highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom and in eternity. Paul describes this, as well as others, as the third heaven. And so this coincides with what we're told in Doctrine and Covenants, section 131, verses 1 through 4, which states, quote, "In the celestial glory there are 3 heavens or degrees, and in order to obtain the highest, a man must enter into this order of the priesthood, meaning the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, and if he does not, he cannot obtain it. He may enter into the other, but that is the end of his kingdom. He cannot have an increase," close quote. So that again reaffirms a concept that I've talked about before, about the state of exaltation exists onlyest in the highest degree of celestial glory, and that could be something that is synonymous with heaven, and more often than not should be considered what heaven really is supposed to be. We talk about the celestial kingdom as heaven, and yes, it is, but the reality of it is, at the end of the day, the place you want to be is the highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom, or heaven, in that sense. All right, and so we have the celestial kingdom located on the earth after the millennium, and this is described in Revelation 21:1, where it says, quote, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea," close quote. So this is the final celestial kingdom that is being described here. It's often described as a sea of glass. It's a giant Urim and Thummim. John describes this post-millennial celestial kingdom as the paradise of God in Revelation 2:7, when he said, quote, "He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the fruit of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God," close quote. Now, if you were remembering our discussion from last time where we were talking about these 12 promises, this was the first promise that was made to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation, or essentially John's letters. And so here he refers to the paradise of God, but you got to be careful because his use of paradise in that context was a reference to the celestial kingdom and to exaltation within the celestial kingdom. So sometimes these words paradise and celestial kingdom and heaven kind of get a little bit mixed up, and that's why you have to be careful and just kind of pay close attention to the context of them. So the word paradise is not found anywhere in the Old Testament, but it occurs 3 times in the New Testament. One of them was Luke 23:43, where the Savior was on the cross and says to the thief, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise." Well, that was a reference specifically to the postmortal spirit world. And so, and sometimes when we use the word paradise in that connection, it has reference to the entirety of the postmortal spirit world, both that side that we typically call paradise and that side which we typically call spirit prison. So essentially, just to make clear that the Savior wasn't necessarily promising this thief that he was going to be in the good side of the spirit world. Okay, so another place that we find the word paradise is in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 2 through 4. And this has reference to Paul's allusion to his vision of the third heaven, where he said, he, meaning reference to himself, he was caught up unto paradise and heard unspeakable words. And that more than likely was something more in the nature of the celestial kingdom, as opposed to just being in paradise, although it could be either one, frankly. And then what I quoted to you a moment ago in Revelation 2:7 that had reference to the tree of life in the midst of the paradise of God, that clearly was a promised reference of exaltation in the celestial kingdom. And so the second 2 uses of paradise seem to be in the nature of the celestial kingdom and not the spirit world, but the lines are blurry. Okay, and the reason that they're blurry is because the conditions in one tend to mirror the conditions in the other. And so John Taylor spoke of this a little bit when he said, quote, John says, "To him that overcometh will I grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God." And he's quoting here Revelation 2:7. This paradise, however, is not the place for resurrected bodies, but for departed spirits. For Jesus said to the thief on the cross, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise." And he was quoting Luke 23:43, close quote. So that's John Taylor taking a different position than what I'm espousing, saying, well, no, Revelation 2:7 is really the place of departed spirits or the postmortal spirit world. I say, no, that has reference to a promise of eternal life, which is in the celestial kingdom. And I say this mostly because, as you can see, there is a difference of opinion on what the meaning is. And the reason these differences of opinions exist is because they tend to look a lot alike, and with good reason that I'll talk about in more detail. Bruce R. McConkie also said this, quote, "Paradise is not heaven. It is not the ultimate home of the saints. It is not the abode of sane beings." And so he quotes Luke 16:19 through 21 in that regard. And I agree with that. Paradise typically is not heaven that we associate with the celestial kingdom. It is connected to the place of departed spirits, as John Taylor said, or the postmortal spirit world. But depending on the context, paradise can be something that is describing the postmortal spirit world, or it might have reference to the celestial kingdom in either case. So let's talk about this a little bit, this concept of heaven and paradise, because when you look at ascension literature or ancient documents that kind of describe the process by which people ascend into and enter into heaven, the ascension literature often distinguishes heaven from paradise. So you have celestial paradise. And in my usage, a lot of times what you'll find me saying is when I talk about celestial paradise, I typically will be talking about the paradise referred to as the good side of the postmortal spirit world, where celestial worthy people can go and find rest, as distinguished from paradise, which is the celestial kingdom of resurrected beings. So at any rate, celestial paradise, in the way that I use the term, has reference to one place, or a hekal, which is a Hebrew word for a palace or temple, and it is just one place of the hekal of various levels. So paradise is a specific location in the celestial realm, and that would refer to the highest heaven, or the Holy of Holies, where God resides on his throne, whereas celestial paradise, in my use of the term, is for disembodied spirits of the dead before they're resurrected. So again, celestial kingdom, resurrected. Celestial paradise, unresurrected, awaiting the resurrection. Now, John separately identifies the celestial kingdom as a new heaven and a new earth in Revelation 21:1, and also in Revelation 21:10 he refers to it as the Holy Jerusalem. So we're not to that point yet, and if we're talking chronologically about John getting us from the point where his vision begins to the celestial kingdom in Revelation 21, unless he's schizophrenic, he's not going to be talking about the same thing in these two different places. And so I take the position that John is not schizophrenic, and that his vision in Revelation 4 is about the celestial paradise rather than the celestial kingdom. Now, it's appropriate that there's, I don't know if it's appropriate, but some blurring of lines does occur, because the one reflects the conditions in the other. And someone who would know about this is Joseph F. Smith, who of course had his vision of the redemption of the dead in the 138th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, and he had this to say on this subject, quote, "The righteous spirit that departs from this earth is assigned its place in the paradise of God. It has its privileges and honors, which are in point of excellency far above and beyond human comprehension. And in this sphere of action, enjoying this partial reward for its righteous conduct on the earth, it continues its labors, and in this respect is very different from the state of the body from which it is released. For while the body sleeps and decays, the spirit receives a new birth. To it, the portals of life are open. It is born again into the presence of God." Close quote. So you can see here, President Smith is specifically describing paradise in the postmortal spirit world, but you're in the presence of God, and you have this condition there that exists that is beyond human comprehension. Well, that sounds a lot like the celestial kingdom, but it's not. He's describing the spirit world, and that's why these lines tend to be blurred, and why some people sometimes get them a little confused. In other words, what I mean by that is sometimes you'll see it in conference talks, you'll see it in journal of discourses sometimes, which aren't really heavily annotated with scriptures, but when they are, a lot of times people will be quoting the vision of quote-unquote heaven in Revelation 4 as though it were the celestial kingdom, when in fact it's not. And vice versa. Sometimes they describe the celestial kingdom in Revelation 21 as though it's connected to the spiritual paradise. All right. So, we take all these things and just have to be a little bit careful in our use of how we're viewing things in the context in which they're arising. But John pretty consistently uses heaven to describe this celestial paradise, which is part of the postmortal spirit world. And compare this to Moroni chapter 10, verse 34, where he said, quote, "I soon go to rest in the paradise of God until my spirit and body shall again reunite," close quote. So that again illustrates the concept that paradise is associated with the postmortal spirit world. And we have the same kind of use in the latter days. For example, Dallin H. Oakes said, quote, "We believe in a heaven or paradise and a hell following mortal life. But to us, that two-part division of the righteous and the wicked is merely temporary, while the spirits of the dead await their resurrections and final judgments," close quote. Now, Orson Pratt also had some words to say about this same concept, and it's a fairly lengthy quote, so let me give you just a little bit of a heads up. As we're looking at this, I want you to pay particular attention to a phrase that you'll find in the middle of it that deals with people who are not resurrected. And I have it underlined in the quote so that it'll pop up. But this is what he has to say, quote, "Let me refer you to the testimony of John, recorded in the 5th chapter of Revelation. John saw a great company of saints in the presence of God the Father, and, except those who were resurrected at the time of the resurrection of Christ, they were the spirits of men. They were singing a beautiful song, the purport of which was immigration. They had it in view to emigrate from their present home or location in the celestial paradise to some other place. The fall had brought them down to the grave, but they rejoiced that the grave would no longer hold its captives. These spirits from all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people were rejoicing in the great day when they should receive their resurrected bodies and return again to their old homestead, the earth, to receive their kingdoms, thrones, and dominions." Close quote. So, sorry about the long quote, but getting back to what John said, he makes it very clear, Orson Pratt, he makes it very clear that we have this postmortal spirit world with the good guys being in the celestial paradise. And notice what he said. He said, where he's talking about them being in the presence of God and there being this great company of saints in the celestial paradise, he said, "Except those who were resurrected at the time of the resurrection of Christ, they were the spirits of men." Now, what's interesting about that is two things. First of all, he talks about some people being resurrected who could still be in this spirit, this postmortal spirit world. That's interesting. It means that there can be this kind of intermingling, if you will, between spirits who are disembodied spirits and people who have resurrected bodies in that realm. I see no reason for that not to be true, but I don't think that that is the norm. I think that these people who were resurrected at the time that Christ was resurrected, people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we have scriptures that talk about how they've gone on to their own kingdoms. So these guys are busy. What are they doing hanging out in the postmortal spirit world? They got worlds to create. And so with a resurrected body and having received their final glory, there's really no reason for them to be hanging out in the postmortal spirit world unless they need to do some training, kind of like, here that we got on our way, always training. So at any rate, now the other thing that is of significance to me about Orson Pratt's statement is he talks about those who were resurrected at the time of the resurrection of Christ. And he says that in relationship to John's vision of what John saw in Revelation chapter 5. Now I say Revelation chapter 5, both 4 and 5 are dealing with celestial paradise. Orson Pratt also says that this celestial paradise had the spirits of men, disembodied spirits of men, unless they were resurrected at the time of Christ. Now what that does is it places it in time, you see. His statement assumes that John is seeing celestial paradise in Revelation chapter 5, and I will add Revelation 4 because one is a continuation of the other. He sees the saints after Christ's resurrection. So that puts it in a moment of time. And this is the beginning of John's vision here in Revelation 4 and 5, where his vision begins and coincides with his vision at the time that he was on the island of Patmos in 96 AD. So he says that, and we're going to talk about other things as to why and how we arrive at the timing of this vision. But the bottom line is John is not seeing the celestial paradise as it will exist at the time of the second coming or as it will exist after the millennium. He's seeing it as it exists at the time of his vision in 96 AD. And so that's going to be an important concept. That's the beginning. That's the yellow brick road where we started at the beginning, right? It all ties back to the vision in 96 AD. So this celestial paradise, of course, is a resting place for the disembodied spirits that we call the spirits of the just. And this coincides with this concept that we have two different resurrections. We have, it's described in John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, the resurrection of the just and the resurrection of the unjust. That coincides and are synonymous with, again, the first resurrection and the second resurrection. So if you have the spirits of the just in the celestial paradise side of the house, and some of those are going to be what are referred to as the spirits of just men made perfect. They inherit the celestial glory, but they also are worthy of exaltation. They are justified, they're ratified, sealed, or approved of God. And so other spirits of the just, generally speaking, can enter into celestial paradise, assuming they have the ordinances of baptism, confirmation, and they lived worthy of those ordinances. They too can go into celestial glory. So we have this hierarchy, just as in D&C 131, 1 through 4, it describes how there are 3 degrees of glory within the celestial glory. Well, guess what? They must also exist in celestial paradise, because these two things tend to mirror each other. And so the same type of hierarchy is necessarily going to exist, because these conditions of one are going to be typical of the other. And so the problem with these similarities is sometimes the symbolism tends to get a little bit discombobulated. I don't know if that's a word, but I guess it is now. But at any rate, so let me give you an illustration of this. For example, in Revelation 4:4, John tells us that he saw 24 elders with crowns seated on thrones, which tends to suggest, oh, they must be in the celestial kingdom after the resurrection. They got crowns. They're seated on thrones. Yeah, that definitely got to be the celestial kingdom, and some interpret it as such. But the details of John's vision indicates that we're in celestial paradise before the resurrection, where they receive a crown that is anticipatory of their final reward when they get to the celestial kingdom, because they tend to mirror each other. Okay, so we'll get into that a little bit more, and we'll find out ways in which people misconstrue that a little bit. But let's talk about how this vision opens in Revelation 4:1. And it starts out with this door in heaven, how it opens, and John tells us that he saw things which must be hereafter. And Revelation 1:1 defines the word hereafter as things which must shortly come to pass. So if you want to get more on that, check out my podcast on Revelation 1 verses 1 through 3, which I did on January 6th of 2024. So if we're talking about things that must be hereafter and which must shortly come to pass, we can't be talking about the celestial kingdom after the millennium. That's a long way away. Even now, it's still a long way away. And John's vision was 2,000 years ago, all right? And so John is seeing the celestial paradise, or the postmortal spirit world, as it existed in 96 AD. And I can, for more timing on this, where am I getting the 96 AD? You can go back and take a look at my Come Follow Me lesson number 2 on October 8th of 2023, where John is talking about his vision on Patmos Island and the viewpoints about, was it during the time of Nero, was it a vision during the time of Domitian, and my conclusions on that lead me to conclude it was in 96 AD. But if you want to hone in on that a little bit, drill down a little bit on 96 AD, go take a look at that podcast. Now, it's important that we nail down the timing of the vision. Why is that? Because celestial paradise is a dynamic place. It's a changing place. There's new spirits coming in all the time. You got spirits going on missions over into spirit prison. There's work. There are preparations going on. So it's a dynamic place. It's just not like you can, you've seen one celestial paradise, you've seen them all. So essentially, John, in his vision, has this snapshot, if you will, of the conditions and who was there as of 96 AD. And if you go to Revelation chapter 7, you're going to get another celestial snapshot of paradise, because this is a paradise as it's going to exist as the second coming is approaching. And it's a very, very different place. I mean, think about all of these people who are entering into paradise, these disembodied spirits, and who was there in 96 AD, and who is there by the time we finally get to the celestial kingdom. I mean, it's the same place, but they're very, very different in terms of who's in them and how many people are in them. And so, again, I invite you to take a look that in my Come Follow Me lesson number 4 for the chronology and getting us from one place to the other. But essentially, the bottom line is the number of people that he saw in celestial paradise in 96 AD was what he saw in Revelation 4 and 5. In Revelation 7, as we've moved forward in time to approaching the second coming, he then says, "Oh, I saw this great multitude which no man can number." And he's surprised by it because he didn't see that when he saw his first vision in Revelation 4 and 5. And so the reason why he has this great multitude that exists as the second coming is nearing versus what he saw in 96 AD is because we have the latter-day work of salvation for both the living and the dead. So what did we have as of 96 AD? If we kind of try and get some sense of who was in paradise as of 96 AD. Well, the one thing that we know is that when Christ was resurrected in 34, call it AD, all of the exaltation worthy saints were resurrected with him. So you had all of these people from the Old Testament times who lived worthy lives. They had their ordinances performed. And so they were, because we got this principle that you got to have your ordinances done before you can be resurrected. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a future podcast. But essentially, it's the law of ordinances. Your ordinances have to be complete, and then you can be resurrected. So all the ones that were resurrected with Christ, they had all their things done for them, all right? And so off they go. So what does that mean for celestial paradise when Christ was resurrected? Well, they all empty out. Now, there's some people there who were worthy, had been baptized, were worthy of celestial glory, but they didn't have the sealing ordinance, for example. Well, they're going to have to wait to be resurrected until later. And so they're still hanging out there. But all the Abrahams of the world, the Isaacs of the world, the Jacobs, they're out building worlds, and they're cleaned out of spirit, the spirit prison in celestial paradise. And so the reality of it is the number of saints that we had as disembodied spirits in celestial paradise is probably not that many. I mean, relatively speaking, not that many. You have basically, as of 96 AD, you had the church that was already starting to fall away, and so you had the saints from the meridian of time for some 35 years, roughly, to 70 AD, and by that time things started to taper off and stuff like that. So there were saints undoubtedly who qualified for exaltation, and their spirits were in spirit prison, their spirit to paradise, excuse me. And John saw them, and this is described, and we'll get into that in more detail. But you also had these the saints in the apostolic period who were performing various vicarious ordinances for the dead. And so once those people had their vicarious ordinances performed, they could go into celestial paradise as well. So it was filling up. So by 96 AD, you had some number. You also have the Nephites who were enjoying the golden era, or a mini millennium after Christ's visit on the American continent. All those people are coming into celestial paradise, and as they died, and they were doing vicarious ordinances for the dead on the American continent as well. And so, yeah, you had a goodly number of people in celestial paradise, but the reality of it is, by the time we get to the second coming, that number is going to be very, very small in comparison to the work we are now doing. Think about the number, the millions of people who are members of the church today and who qualify themselves while they are living to enter celestial paradise, to then ultimately be resurrected into the celestial kingdom. And then all of the vicarious ordinances that we're now performing, so that people at the time of the second coming can come forth in the morning of the first resurrection. I mean, there's no comparison in terms of the numbers. And so as John goes from chapter 4 and 5 in 96 AD, looking in chapter 7 at what he describes as this great multitude which no man could number, he can only be talking about the conditions that then exist at a much later time, and specifically at the time of the second coming. So that's why, we have to understand the timing of when these things are coming, and not just the places, because it's just a very dynamic place, and so that's why it's important. And once you understand that, then the chronology, you can see, oh yeah, John's not being schizophrenic at all. He's not bouncing all over the map. He's just very consistent going through, and what he sees in the nature of his discussions confirm that. Okay, so I want to take a look now at some of the symbols that you find primarily in Revelation 4 that show why heaven, the word that John uses in Revelation 4 is actually the celestial paradise as of 96, and not a vision of paradise as it might exist, after the second coming, after the millennium, when the earth dies and is resurrected and it's the celestial kingdom. So the bottom line is we're going to be looking at verses that tend to confirm why John is seeing a vision of celestial paradise in 96 AD versus the celestial kingdom, which could only be something that comes after the millennium and after the earth dies and is resurrected. Okay, so let's start at Revelation 4:2, which says this, quote, "And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne," close quote. So I quoted that a little bit ago, but now let me emphasize the point that what John is seeing here in verse 2 is God the Father is seated on the throne. That means that this scene is occurring before the second coming, because when we get into later chapters in the book of Revelation, we're going to see that Christ is on the throne with the Father after the second coming. So this can't be the second coming now, because only the Father is on the throne. And by the same token, we don't have all of the other exalted saints on the throne either. So this can't be the celestial kingdom, or else it would be talking about that. And I kind of alluded to that a little bit ago when I said, hey, where's the rest of us? Okay, then we come down to Revelation 4:4. That says, quote, "And round about the throne were 24 seats, and upon the seats I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment, and they had on their head crowns of gold," close quote. Now I mentioned this also a little bit ago, and how this gets confused with the celestial kingdom, because that does tend to sound a lot like that could be the celestial kingdom. You got them on thrones, you got the gold crowns, they're in white clothing. That's got to be the celestial kingdom. And a lot of people, you go through it, trust me, you go through and you see somebody talking about the celestial kingdom and the people in the celestial kingdom, and they're going to be quoting Revelation 4:4 for that proposition, and that's not correct. And how do we know that? That's because if you take a look at Doctrine and Covenants, section 77, verse 5, it explains this verse. Now, section 77 is the Q&A session that Joseph Smith had with the Lord about some of these images that we see in the book of Revelation. So here in verse 5 it says, quote, and then asks the question, "What are we to understand by the 24 elders spoken of by John?" And the answer, "We are to understand that these elders whom John saw were elders who had been faithful in the work of the ministry and were dead, who belonged to the 7 churches and were then in the paradise of God," close quote. So you notice here, this verse is specifically confirming that we're talking here about these 24 elders who were spirits. We haven't gotten to the second coming when they will be resurrected, and they're still dead. But their spirits live on as disembodied spirits, and these are those of the 7 churches. And so they represent righteous people from among the 7 churches who we've talked a lot about. And they are in the paradise of God, meaning celestial paradise, the postmortal spirit world. And so that means that this verse clearly predates the second coming, because if they had gotten to the second coming, these righteous saints would then be resurrected. And so also if you go to the 11th chapter of the book of Revelation, in verse 16, it's talking about these same 24 elders, or who I just call the 24 elders. Now, these guys get mentioned 12 times in the book of Revelation. So the reference to them here in Revelation 4, this is just the first time we're going to see these guys a whole bunch more times, 11 in fact. And one of those times is Revelation 11:16, where it says, quote, "And the 24 elders which sat before God on their seats fell upon their faces and worshipped God," close quote. And so what we know is the events in Revelation chapter 11, verse 16, is the time period when the 2 witnesses are prophesying in Jerusalem before the second coming. And at the time of their death, you'll recall they die. They lie in the streets for 3.5 days, and that brings an end to the second woe. And the second woe ends actually as there is a trump that goes off, and they rise up. Oh, end of the second woe. And guess what? This 11:16, what I just read to you about these 420 elders in that verse, that tells us this occurs at the time of the third woe. So the second woe ends with the two witnesses resurrecting. Next thing you know, we see these 24 elders. They're still sitting on their seats. They got their thrones. They're falling on their face, worshiping God. And guess what? This specifically tells us it's still before the second coming, which tells us all the way back here to Revelation chapter 4. It was also well before the second coming. And John saw them essentially as they were at the time of his vision in 96 AD. Okay, Revelation 4:5 also tells us, I'm not going to throw it up there, but he talks about the seven spirits of God. And these seven spirits, which are seen here in Revelation 4:5, are specifically identified as the seven servants or leaders from the seven churches. So again, they are not resurrected in John's vision in 96 AD because they are specifically called spirits in Revelation 4:5. And these seven spirits, who are the leaders of the churches, are all in the company of the 24 elders, all of whom are in the paradise of God, as referred to in Doctrine and Covenants section 77:5. Okay, another little helpful hint here in Revelation 4:6, which says this, quote, "And before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were four beasts full of eyes before and behind." Close quote. Now, this verse is one that gets a lot of attention, and a lot of people are going to quote this particular verse as being an indication of the celestial kingdom. And it's true that the celestial kingdom is described as a sea of glass like unto crystal. It sounds like the Urim and Thummim, which we find described in the Doctrine and Covenants. And so a lot of people will say, okay, this is clearly indicates that John's vision in Revelation 4 must be the celestial kingdom because it has this reference to the sea of glass. That's the celestial kingdom. Well, yes and no. Keep in mind again that these things mirror each other, so there's no incongruity in the idea that you have a sea of glass that could also represent the celestial paradise. But the big thing about this is look at what this is described as the sea of glass, and it says that before the throne there was a sea of glass. So the throne, God's throne, the place of his celestial residence or celestial kingdom, is not located where the sea of glass is. You see the distinction? Before the throne there was a sea of glass, meaning the sea of glass lies in proximity before the sea of glass. And so we're not talking about before as in time, we're talking about before as in location. So you have the throne of God located in one place, and then in front of that you have this sea of glass, right? And it's like crystal. But the throne's not in it, because if the throne were in it, that would clearly have to represent the celestial kingdom, because the throne sits in the celestial kingdom. But here it's not sitting there, which tells you, oh, this can't be the celestial kingdom because the throne of God isn't in the celestial kingdom. The throne is not in the sea of glass. It's not in the midst of the sea of glass. And so John's imagery separate or distinguishes the sea of glass from God's throne. And all we can gather from this is that they are in proximity, and the relative relationship between them is such that they tend to mirror each other. But again, people are going to quote Revelation 4:6 as being a representation or an image of the celestial kingdom, but what it really represents is celestial paradise. All right, one more verse and then we'll call it a day. Revelation 4:8 says, quote, "And the four beasts had each of them 6 wings about him, and they were full of eyes within, and they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come." Close quote. Now here in this holy, 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 you have that's called the Trisagion, okay? And we'll talk about it more later on. And we're going to spend some time talking about these 4 beasts and who they are when we break these individual verses down in more detail. The important point of this verse that helps us to define what the time period is in which we are talking is in the last phrase where the 4 beasts are praising God, and they identify him as which was and is and is to come. Did you catch it? The phrase is to come. This can't be an image or vision of the celestial kingdom after the second coming, after the millennium, after the earth dies and resurrected, and we actually have the celestial kingdom established on this resurrected earth. That can't be what it's describing, because it's talking about the Lord who is still to come. If he's still to come, that's still in the future. And so that has reference to the fact that the second coming cannot have even happened, because we're still waiting for him to come. They're worshiping a God which is to come, and that is only going to happen at the time of the second coming. And so that again reaffirms that John is not seeing the celestial kingdom here in Revelation chapter 4. Now, why have I pounded on this? The reason is because this is of paramount importance to the sequencing of the revelation. If John is talking here in Revelation 4 about the celestial kingdom, it would suggest that the book of Revelation is not necessarily chronological. He's going to be all over the map, and I'd say schizophrenic, and it could be, but he's not. He goes in methodical order. And if you understand that the heaven that he refers to here in verse 7 as his visions open, and that vision coincides with what he's seeing in 96 AD, and there's going to be a progression of his visions of paradise as time goes on, with more and more people being added and things of that nature, then the entire imagery starts to make sense. But if we miss this fundamental point, then we're kind of lost from the beginning, and we never do really recover from it. So the conclusion is that I've tried to do this overview of chapter 4 to help you with a sequencing of the visions, to help you understand the distinction between celestial paradise of disembodied spirits from the celestial kingdom of resurrected and exalted persons who will dwell upon this earth as the final abode of the saints. And if you understand these fundamental truths, then you're going to get an A+ here in Revelation 101. But you have to know these things before we go on to the higher level revelation courses and stuff that we will get into this. And so just keep in mind, the visions of John are very dynamic, and a snapshot of what he sees, in this case of celestial paradise at one time, doesn't necessarily mean that he's looking at the same thing. It might be in the same contextual basis, but two very different scenes, because of the dynamics of how things change. And so I hope that's been helpful to you. We'll continue next week by talking about John's vision in Revelation chapter 4, but we're going to focus now on the verses. So we've kind of had the trees, the overview of the trees, as I talked about in my last podcast, and now we're going to start digging into the details of the individual trees that we find here in Revelation 4 by looking at Revelation 4:1. So I thank you for watching, listening, subscribing, sharing, etc., etc. And thanks to Jenna for all her help technologically, and I will see you next week.